Welcome, everybody, to the Youth Ministers live interview. And today I have a very, very special guest. This man has done so much for us in the scope and lens of youth ministry. And I'm talking about the one and only Frank Mercadante. So, everybody, welcome Frank to our interview today. As we give him an applause. And welcome, Frank. So, can you let us know who you are? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. Frank Mercadante. I've been, let's start with, I've been married almost 40 years, 6 kids, 5 grandkids, 3 on the way. So a big part of our lives is, of course, our family. And I think I've learned a lot about then youth ministry by raising kids. We had 6 and 8 years, all millennials. That really gave me quite an education on how to do youth ministry these days. I was a youth minister in a parish for about 10 years, and then formed Cultivation Ministries, which is going to be entering its 30th year soon. So we've been around for a while. Our mission was to cultivate Catholic youth ministry. We used an agricultural metaphor to help explain the process of building the youth ministry. You've got to prepare the soil, you've got to sow, you got to grow, you got to reap, and you kind of integrate all of those different phases, those different focuses into youth ministry. So that's that's a little bit about my background. A lot of recent work has been in generations, kind of understanding millennials, who kind of threw us a real hook, really changed how we do youth ministry. And now, of course, we've got Z that are in our high schools, and so they have some different nuances too. So that's a little bit of my background, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us today. And I've heard of Cultivation Ministries, especially working with Ella and the Archdiocese of New York, but I never knew that it had such a heavy agricultural background, and it makes so much sense now. But one of the things that I was thinking of as you were explaining it was almost like a winery of growing the grapes and harvesting, but then also knowing which certain plants have pieces that are not growing as you need to. So kind of removing them, but in strategic ways. And I think that's so interesting too, that's a part of the reaping and the sowing. But as we begin this conversation, one thing that has been so important for us within our office and the work that we do, that you have provided with Ella, is really understanding and diving into the generations of youth ministry. So 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. So can you share a little bit about that with us today?
Sure. 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 is kind of borrowing from the whole software system. 1.0 obviously is kind of that, maybe might explain a little bit more of that original expression of youth ministry. We call it the youth group. And then 2.0 kind of built on that. In 1976, there was a document written, The Vision of Youth Ministry, that helped develop what we call comprehensive youth ministry. So 2.0 is that comprehensive expression. I could go into more detail in a little bit here, but just as an overview. Now 3.0 started to emerge when millennials came on the scene. Millennials were very different from the boomers, very different from Gen X. And we started to think of moving into not just kind of age segregated youth ministry, not just comprehensive youth ministry, but reaching young people through family, and also reaching young people through the intergenerational connection of community. So those 3 expressions, their youth ministries could be in just like software, where you have 1.2, 2.3. So sometimes we borrow some expressions from the generation ahead, but we're not fully in that generation. So it has some complexity that way. And I could go into details about each of those.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Okay. So let's start out with 1.0 youth group. a lot of places start here, and it's a good place to start. Years ago it was what we did, and generally, and I'm going to look at these generations in kind of two different focuses. One is who are our audience, and who are participants, and our leadership. So in this case, most of the time the youth group really catered towards a homogenous group. They're the kids who would go there because they're the church kids. They're naturally inclined to be involved. So they were often often this youth group became their social group too. And that's where some of the difficulties years ago, people would say, yeah, I'd go to that youth group, but it's so cliquey. And it would happen because you'd have a group of people who had similar interests, focus, and they bonded together. And oftentimes the flip side of cohesion is often exclusion, because you don't want people necessarily to interrupt the cohesion that you're having, so it gets a little bit clicky. And that word click, it's interesting because it comes from the door clicking behind. I'm trying to get in, but someone just clicked the door behind. So that was one of the vulnerabilities of this. Now, so it was basically homogenous participants, but the leadership was often one person or a dynamic couple or dynamic priest. Years ago, when we had enough of them to go around, that's how, like when I was young, you'd have the young newly ordained that young people thought, this guy's really cool. He has some charismatic sense to him. Or you had these dynamic couples, but often the leadership tended to be one person, a couple, or one person with a couple of helpers. And what would happen inevitably is that person, like if it was a priest, they'd be moving on in 3 years. If it was maybe a dynamic couple, because they were doing it all, they would usually get exhausted, suffer burnout. Usually you have a little time in a mental institution to recover. No, that was, but they would, but often you'd have people kind of like moving in and moving out. And one of the other vulnerabilities of this expression is that the youth group tended to take on the personality of the leader. So you could have a leader who was totally into spirituality, and so you had a really spiritual youth group. There were some that were totally into social. You had a social youth group. There were others that it's all about social justice and service, athletics. So oftentimes you would have a very focused and one kind of a one focused type of youth group. So the vulnerabilities were: one, homogenous crowd just reaching one group of people; two, vulnerability to burnout for leaders because they were doing it all themselves; three, a youth group that was tended to be focused on a certain element of youth ministry without a balanced approach. So there are a lot of people still, are focusing on that and doing this kind of expression of youth ministry, and sometimes that's necessary. And I don't mean like that. It's often a good place to start. And in some places, it may be the expression that maybe works best. Now, what built off of that, in 1976, there was a document written, The Vision of Youth Ministry. And what it did was it introduced goals, goals about, helping the person grow as a whole person, goals about integrating young people into the life of the church and the mission of the church. So there was two goals at that time. And then they introduced 7 components of youth ministry, components such as, community, advocacy, justice and service, leadership, which they called enablement, which we wouldn't use that term anymore, but they introduced components. And so what happened was there was a movement where we are now addressing a larger scope of young people. Because there are young people who want to lead. There are young people who need to be evangelized, which was one of the components was word, which included evangelization and catechesis. So there are kids that need to be evangelized. There are kids who wanted to be leaders. There are kids who wanted to grow in their faith. There are kids who wanted to express their faith through justice and service. And so what happened was there was a great expansion of audience. And in addition to that, there was an expansion in leadership. So instead of just having the youth group leader, or maybe the youth minister, there was the introduction of the coordinator of youth ministry. And the coordinator then had a team of people who gave their gift and their time to the expression of the youth ministry. So there might be a team leader who was, in charge of retreats, another one in charge of, the evangelistic gatherings, another that was doing justice and service ministry. So what we had was a little bit more of a protection of our leader because they weren't doing everything. And there was also where you're integrating other volunteers who had so much to give into the youth ministry, people who had expertise in certain areas, and so you had this whole team approach. Maybe the vulnerability of it was that it was primarily age segregated. So a lot of what you had is that young people tended to be auxiliary to the life of the church.
Mm-hmm.
They were connected to the life of the church, usually through their youth minister, their youth ministry team, but they generally weren't involved in the larger church. And you could see, when their youth group ended, many of them may not have had that connection to the life of the parish. And for many of them, maybe church ended when their youth group ended. And it was also presuming that the only way young people could grow was simply through interaction with each other and maybe some significant adults that were just focused on, just the age segregated youth ministry. So it's kind of this ghettoized approach where Creasy Dean called it the one-ear Mickey. Where there's the life of the church, and then the kids, there was one ear that was kind of connected. Yeah, exactly. and usually that connection point was the youth minister, or the team. It definitely expanded because prior to that we're just reaching the kids who wanted to be there. In some ways it was kind of preaching to the choir. But now there was this expanded approach, which was a very positive and important move. The other thing I want to say, we could get really critical of that approach in the sense that we're only, young. We have kind of this segmented approach. We could get kind of critical of that today. But honestly, at the time, that was probably the most appropriate pastoral response to those generations. The boomers and Gen X, the last people they wanted to be with were like their parents. They were generations that were very much about being together. Their peers were very important. They were not necessarily as close to their parents as many millennials and Gen Z were. And so if their parents were there, they were often like, I don't want to be a part of this. So it was an appropriate pastoral response. But then came the millennials. And they changed everything. They're a very different generation. And one of the things we started to notice very early on was that they were close to their parents. They liked their parents. They didn't mind being with their parents, generally speaking. They didn't want to be with them 24/7, but they definitely were moving in a direction of this closeness. Their parents were their heroes. They were moving away from Gen X and boomers would have sport heroes, and they were much more about our heroes are the people that were are closest to us. So it really started to open up a whole different way of doing ministry, where we started to look at the importance of ministry with parents, because at that point, a lot of research came out. The National Study on Youth and Religion started to make it clear that the greatest social influence on the religious and spirituality of young people were their parents. And so what we found was change had to be made. And a part of that change, which kind of moved us into third generation, was doing ministry with parents, helping equip, support parents in their role as primary, evangelizer, religious educator of their own children. And so there's this household focus that occurs in 3.0. And also because a lot of young people have, millennials, they started to do much more organized sports. Gen X and boomers, a lot of times we just kind of put things together ourselves. We didn't necessarily all have uniforms, and so we did we weren't uh, it wasn't as adult focused, and so much of everything now became adult focused. And so a part of that was that young people became very comfortable with adults, and so it also introduced another element that would become a distinction of third generation, and that is that young people are open to be integrated into the larger life of the church, that they are okay with doing things that aren't just youth segregated. And this then, and so now 3.0, with especially with those two important distinctions, plus 3.0 does include the age segregated too. So it has intergenerational, it has the focus of family and household faith, and then it has age segregated, where you're doing things with your own peers. And all three of those are very essential to it. But we, young people, were then we made more conscious efforts to integrate them into the larger life of the community. And so what happened with that is our leadership expanded. So we follow leadership from that one individual in 1.0 to the team in 2.0. But in 3.0, the whole parish becomes a youth minister. Because if you what the whole idea is to integrate young people in every aspect of church life. That's appropriate. I mean, you don't necessarily want them to be on the marriage counseling team or that sort of. But they could be ushers. They could be on parish council. And so integrating them into those environments is what happens is you multiply the faith influencers in their life. So they may be praying with the ushers and learning about the ushers' stories, and hearing about their faith journey, and then walking into church on Sunday and being greeted by a dozen ushers who know them. They might be 10 years old, really.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like 10 guys said hello to me by name today. I feel like I'm a part of this. I'm feeling like I'm contributing, which is really an important element of church. So young people, what it does is it develops this whole affiliated faith. It was just the faith of the heart. I feel connected. I feel God's presence here. It's the faith of belonging. I fit in. People know me, and I have a role here. So it's also borrowed faith. Affiliated faith is a faith where you haven't really developed your own identity yet. And so you borrow your identity from others. It's common as you're growing up. I mean, that's why, a 10-year-old might say he's a Republican or might say he's a Democrat. And you may ask, well, what is it? What is it about those platforms that you adhere to? And so, they may know nothing about the platform, but my dad is a Republican. My dad is a Democrat. And so what happens? You borrow your identity. And so as you borrow your faith from people around you, it gives you the solid foundation that when you start to move into searching faith, when you start to question, is this something I believe myself? You have this deep, rich foundation of relationships, of witness that grounds you, that says, the best people I know are people who believe and follow Jesus. Why would I want to venture from that? There's a quality of life that I've seen, and a purpose, focused life I've seen in people that I want for myself. So what happens is this third generation of youth ministry really it fosters that whole sense of belonging for young people, and that affiliated faith, which is a necessary foundation to move you into owned and personal faith. But what we have, we have our audience. Let's talk about that again. So we talked about, we had the homogenous group, then it grew to more young people, but now our audience is the whole parish. It's intergenerational, and in all the connections that brings. And the leadership expanded to the whole parish too. So the usher is the youth minister now, who has the young person in it. The hospitality team is, our youth ministers. So now you have multiple faith influences in young people's lives. So there's a kind of an overview of those three generations.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And one thing that really stood out to me that you had mentioned in the realm of um, 3.0 was this idea of faith influencers. And I know for young people and millennials, but also more so Gen Z, their celebrities are influencers now on social media. And so rather than the young person saying, my favorite actor is Tom Hanks or whoever it might be, they say, my favorite YouTube channel is this person. My favorite, person on TikTok is this person. And that's the person that they look up to. But the influencers are the one who encourage them to wear certain clothes or to listen to certain music, but the faith influencers, as you mentioned, are the ones who help them to begin to develop and understand their faith. And I thought that was a really, really interesting point.
Yeah.
So for youth ministry programs that are operating, one thing that we've been really intentional with is in developing youth ministry to help parishes understand uh, and also understanding language, to not call it the youth group because it puts them in that 1 year Mickey immediately. So what do you think is something that is practical that a parish can do to kind of help them jump into that next aspect or generation of youth ministry?
Sure. It could happen slowly. Maybe it begins with some advocacy towards getting young people involved in the larger life of the church. And so, one of the things that we've done is we've tried to gather all the ministry leaders together and ask them. Well, first, I think one of the things is that ministry leaders, they're older, many of us, and so we often take our generational biases into into our ministry. So many young people who are Gen X or Boomers, they're thinking to themselves, well, I didn't want to be around my parents. Kids aren't going to want to be around me, and that's a bias that isn't true with Gen Z today. They don't mind us, and so we have to talk about, like, okay, they're different and they like you, and you could be a powerful influence in their lives. And then secondly, we got to ask, okay, why don't we all examine our ministries and say, and see what is an appropriate age that people could do this, and then determine that. But then also you've got to, you just because you change the age doesn't mean everyone's going to flock to it. So you're going to have to somehow really do some work in trying to get young people to do it. And as young people start to see other young people doing some of these larger ministries in the church, whether it be hospitality, whether it be, ushering and so forth, they'll start to see, wait a second, maybe I could do that too. So it is a slow process, but you could start to integrate it that way. And I think you also have to ask, what are we doing for parents?
Mm-hmm.
How are we supporting, resourcing, encouraging, partnering with parents? How are we helping them build household faith? That's another, and it may start small. Maybe you develop a team of parents who really do care about this and let them launch that kind of ministry. And maybe it involves, like, hey, 3 times a year we have a seminar that's really focused on, how to parent adolescents, how to develop faith in our children, how to deal with social media, things that are really relevant for parents. And maybe what spins off of that is some support and resources. But you could start small. You don't have to dive in, at full submersion to
Mm,
begin.
absolutely. Um, and in thinking of that, as you were mentioning that different generations respond in different ways, especially to the presence of parents. How has youth ministry changed with the times, especially with where the church is at today?
Yeah, it always changes. I think that's an important thing for us to realize, that if you really study the mission, of missionary work in the church, it always has responded to the culture. It always has responded to the context. And I think that's one thing that we have to realize, that sometimes we could get married, like you can marry certain ways, or canonize the way we came to Christ, the way our faith has become meaningful. I think we have to be students of the culture, especially in youth ministry. I honestly think today, one of the things that well, I think, we all know of how much anxiety young people are struggling with these days, so I think responding to that by providing communities where people could be listened to, where they could be loved. And I do think intergenerational, because a lot of the issues that young people are struggling with, adults have navigated. And to know that there is light at the end of the tunnel, to know that there are we survived it. We got through it. It's okay. You can do this with the support around you and some of the guidance of people who've pioneered that road. I think we have to respond to what we see is in front of us. I do think the dominant spiritual hunger today is for community, real connection. And this is going to be, definitely, it's going to become even more important in today's environment, because everyone, being quarantined, being away from people are going to hunger for real connection, not just places where people gather, but places where not only do we gather, but we meet Jesus in one another by our love and our care for one another. So this is a postmodern generation, and postmodern it has moved away from the abstract belief-centered faith, and what it really longs for is a concrete faith, a faith that works in real life. And so they will see Jesus enfleshed in others in many ways. So they'll respond to the Holy Spirit in us as we love, as we reach out. It isn't so much about believing the right things in a postmodern generation. It's about seeing those things being expressed in real life. So those are important nuances and changes that we have to respond to. Oftentimes we think if young people just believe the right things, everything will be fine. But that's an expression of a modern faith, not a postmodern faith. And so that's another a very important distinction of working with young people today.
Absolutely. And in that, the reality of working with young people, a lot of, as we are working back towards reopening churches and being involved again in the space of church, what is one way that teens can be ministered to, even if there is not a youth ministry program? So some parishes are wondering, what can we do to serve our teens? We don't have a youth ministry program, but how can we start, even if this is not happening?
Yeah. Well, I think just integrating them into the life of the church, saying hello to them, reaching out to them, making them feel welcomed. You don't have to necessarily have a age segregated youth ministry to do great youth ministry. Invite them in. I think on Sundays, um, I think young people, when they walk in there, if they don't see, like, if they may see people like, hey, I see them every week. I don't know their names. I don't know their story. We need to start to introduce ourselves. We need to start calling people by name when we see them. All of those things will help people feel like they belong. And I do think I think it's not just young people, but I think people are hungering for real connection. We sometimes mistake community as, hey, we're all here together. We believe the same stuff, but that isn't enough for most people. They want to know, like, who is that person sitting next to me? I want to have a real connection with them. And so starting to move in that direction, as all, like, not only with young people, I mean, just start introducing yourself, start calling people by names, stop kind of just doing the kind of anonymous mass thing that we have become very accustomed to. It will not work, especially as we move forward post-pandemic. They're going to go to those places where they feel genuinely connected.
Hmm. Absolutely. And, I've seen that across many different parishes, of that welcoming aspect, but also the anonymous mass as well. And I know growing up, we would sit in the same pew. We'd be in that pew for, years and years and decades and not know the person who sits 4 pews ahead of us, and they're there every single Sunday, and we see them at the grocery store, or we see them outside. We say, do I know that person from somewhere? Where do I know them from? It's like, yes, you go to mass together, you receive Jesus together, um, but it's only like, oh, I can only see and talk to that person when I'm at mass. And then also there's the example of walking into a mass, or a church that may not generally be the parish that you go to on Sunday, and the pews are completely open, but the seats are taken on the both ends at the posts. And so people are like, oh, I can't go in that pew, there's somebody sitting there. I have to go in a pew where there's nobody, and I gotta sit in the end and make sure people feel, they can't come in. But very consciously in the last couple of months, well, before the pandemic, I made it a point to make sure that I would walk into a pew and sit in the center so that people felt welcome, that they could come in. But what I found was that I was the only one sitting in the center of the pew. And so I had the entire pew to myself and whoever was coming to mass with me. But it really is an interesting point to start by saying hello, sharing a name. It's so important. But I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today and joining us in our office endeavors of this YouTube series. But how can people learn more about Cultivation Ministries, and how can people find you?
Sure. You could go to our website, which is, cultivationministries.com. You could learn about some of the training opportunities that we have, some of the resources. The book, Engaging a New Generation, really unfolds all three of those generations. And it really expands on how to actually do third generation youth ministry. That's available on the website. It's available at Amazon. So it would give you a much greater detailed approach to this whole third generation youth ministry. So those are two ways you can reach me at frank@cultivationministries.com. Also, if there's something specific that I might be able to help with.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll definitely be praying for you and the ministry, for your family. Um, And yeah, thank you so much. Can't say it enough for all you've done, for your inspiration, your leadership. So thank you,
Thanks.
thank you, thank you. And
Thank
I
you.
look forward to doing this again one day.
Yeah, I hope so. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Keep up the great work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. All right. And also, for those of you watching at home right now, you can follow us at OYMNY on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Make sure you share it and let us know what is the most important thing that you heard today. And at your parish, are you generation 1.0, 2.0, or 3.0? And how can you get your parish to 3.0? If you're having a tough time trying to figure that out, make sure you check out Frank's book so you can study, you can read, and check out the great resources. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you in the next video. Take care.